So what's the next question?
Yeah, so that's a great prelude to the next question, which is about the right, and focusing on maybe a couple of the threads that you just laid down there. The question's about how the US-backed military dictatorships from the 50s up to the 80s negotiate their relationship with Francoism and more generally to Spain. So the first question here is, how did the Reconquista imaginary reappropriated by Franco play out in South America and Latin America? And this is a context where the pride of the criollos was combining their Hispanidad with forms of nationalism, anti-post colonial nationalism, and their whiteness with a Catholic civilizing mission. So that's the first question.
Okay.
Another question
Why don't I just answer the first question?
Well, you could.
No, it's okay. I love a multi-part
question. The second one here is related, and that is, to what extent were communists, but also some social democrats, liberals, social movements, indigenous and feminist social movements, racialized to fit this regenerative fascist or quasi-fascist project in Spain, this moment where Spain and its regime were in kind of terminal decline. And the kind of background to this question, of course, is that the Spanish Civil War framework is playing out alongside or during a neoliberal model, a la the Chicago Boys, and a neoconservative model also, a la the kind of U.S. positioning of Jeane Kirkpatrick, dividing some governments along either authoritarian or totalitarian designation, so as to figure out when exactly you're going to intervene. So different dimensions there.
Yeah. So this is really important because this is another tie-in to the contemporary world, right? Which is that the political project of Francoism sells itself, I think, to the United States in particular as being, sort of primarily anti-communist. But the real target is not Bolshevism per se. I mean, that's a target. But the real sort of phenomenon that the Spanish far right sees as the kind of the poisonous core of all of our problems today is the Enlightenment. And the thing that they want to reverse, or the moment that they want to return to, is like an idealized version of the early modern Spanish village in which that are governed by the subsidiarity principle, where, the guilds of church and army and family are the sort of the glue that binds together the social order, in which verticality and hierarchy are core principles, in which you have a confessional state, all of this stuff. And so they hate the Enlightenment because they think that liberalism, basically, as they understand it, and liberal universalism are a slippery slope that makes possible communism later. But it's not enough to just cut off the head of communism, because then you still have the slippery slope of liberalism creating all kinds of deformed modern ideas about, universal suffrage or gender equality or secularism, or things that don't have to go so far as to be explicitly communist or socialist in their realization, to continue to nevertheless threaten that early modern idealized hyper-hierarchical vertical order. And so so that's one current that I think that I have been very interested to see the resurgence of explicitly in contemporary far-right discourse, where there are, very overt, particularly in the US, right, like this kind of new fawning over Franco, right? This is sort of the Rod Dreher, Catholic integralist universe of post-liberals. Like, that is all super, super consonant with the Francoist project. The other piece in terms of the racialization is that during the Spanish Civil War itself, there was an army psychiatrist who fought with the nationalists named Antonio Vallejo Nájera. And Vallejo Nájera did a version of a kind of set of Mengele-style experiments on Republican political prisoners in 1938 and 1939 with Franco's permission, the purpose of which was to prove his idea of what he calls la eugenesia de la hispanidad, Hispanic eugenics. And so this was a kind of biophilosophical Frankenstein kind of theory. You know, it's hard to use the tools of intellectual history on some of these guys because. But nevertheless, having read the voluminous literary production, so shall we say, of this particular guy, they certainly thought of themselves as intellectuals and conducted themselves as such. But so the idea of these experiments that Vallejo Nájera was given official license to conduct was that there was a red gene, that basically Marxism had an epigenetic dimension, and that the eugenics of hispanidad, of hispanity, were basically inhered in a kind of spiritual brotherhood of the Castilian language and the Catholic faith. That this was the raza, the race. And it's weird because it's a race whose primary characteristics are not bloodline, but are rather traits that one could opt into by learning the language and by adopting the faith, right? But that's the whole colonial evangelizing principle, that you can kind of enter the race if you accept the Spanish imperial metaphysics, right? But so in the eugenics of Hispanity, according to this character who after the Civil War gets elevated, he basically becomes like the most powerful psychiatrist in Franco's medical establishment and is hugely influential in the medical profession under the dictatorship for decades. So he's a big deal and people read him in Latin America. But so this idea that, okay, so the race, which is this faith and language-based spiritual fraternity, is threatened by the invading virus of the red gene of Marxism. And that therefore, and that the red gene produces psychotic and schizophrenic behaviors such as the reversal of tradition, or the undermining of traditional gender roles, the destruction of the family, all of this kind of stuff. The gender ideology, as we would call it in kind of contemporary far-right terms. And so he develops this whole theory of how you can allegedly square the Catholic social doctrine with an exterminationist project to destroy the corrupting influence of the red gene in order to save the Hispanic race. And one of the ways that you do that, according to Dr. Vallejo Nájera, is when you have children who are born into left-wing families. You can't kill the children. You oughtn't to kill the children, although they did sometimes, and they certainly killed the parents, but you oughtn't to kill the leftists involved. But what you must do is you must separate the children from the left-wing family. And the theory being that if the children are exposed to the proper spiritual fraternity of the Hispanic raza, that they can be redeemed, that you can basically fight and defeat the virus of Marxism and the red gene by limiting its expression through the rehoming of literally stolen children to be raised by patriotic, nationalist, right-wing Christian families. And so this gets elevated in the Franco dictatorship to the level of state policy and informs generations of baby stealing, honestly, of ripping children, infants, from their birth families, often with the parents incarcerated and political prisoners, and rehoming them through phalangist state-run networks of orphanages with the collusion of the Catholic Church. And this is a phenomenon that in Spain, contemporary activists and survivors, victims of this system, are continuing to dig through the traces of. This is very much an ongoing political issue in contemporary Spain. Later on, once you have the onset of the high Cold War era dictatorships in Latin America, in several of them, We also see the concerted policy of military juntas to destroy families in this fashion with the idea of rehabilitating the race from its having been infected by the red virus. So there is an explicit biologization of an assumed set of left ideological positions that is used as justification for the, and most, I think people know this story most vividly in Argentina, where the project of the mothers and the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo has been to try and restore the identities of some of the infants, many of whom were born in captivity to imprisoned mothers who were subsequently murdered by the state, to try and restore the identities of those children who number roughly 500 or so, although that's probably an undercount in total. And the madres and the abuelas have identified now about 150 of them. But that is similarly still a project that is ongoing. And one of the Argentine forensic geneticists who helped develop the DNA testing protocols that have allowed those social movement organizations to identify using new DNA tools, to identify those stolen children, now adults, biological identities, said explicitly the Argentine junta was following the teachings of Vallejo Nájera when they did this to our people. So there are very explicit connections there to a form of eliminationist ideology and practice that presented itself as being consonant with and originating from Catholic doctrine, which is insane, for lack of a better term, in one sense. But it wasn't just in Argentina, it also happened in Guatemala, it also happened in El Salvador. And so, there are a variety of ways in which these practices that were established by the Franco dictatorship, and which the dictatorship attempted quite explicitly, not always successfully, but had organizations and a kind of bureaucratic apparatus to try and export to Latin America through the 40s and 50s and 60s. We see that those seeds took root, right? Then on the economic question, right, and the sort of neoliberalism, Chicago Boys, as you mentioned, sort of that whole piece of things. There's a great new book by a historian named Daniel Kressel called Hispanic Technocracy. And what it looks at is how Franco's Spain, Ongania's Argentina, so the dictatorship, one of the dictatorships immediately before the 1976 junta, that is the one that most people are familiar with, but the Onganía dictatorship from 66 to 70, which was explicitly Francoist, and then Chile under Pinochet, how they basically, how in those three societies, regimes that originated very much out of a kind of Hispanist, corporatist economic model or set of ideas transformed themselves into early versions of neoliberalism. And Opus Dei is a really big part of that story. And interestingly, this is another one of my little Spanish Civil War rabbit holes. So Jose Maria Escrivá, who is the Spanish prelate, the cleric who founds Opus Dei, the reason that he survives the Spanish Civil War to then go on and actually create the global empire of Opus Dei is because the Honduran legation, the diplomatic office of Honduras in Madrid during the Spanish Civil War, shelters him for 6 months while the anti-fascist militias are roaming around Madrid trying to kill precisely people like this guy. They hide him, they protect him, they give him Honduran diplomatic papers, and when the fighting kind of eases up in Madrid a little bit, he uses his Honduran fake ID basically to get himself out of Madrid and into the nationalist zone, whereupon he goes on to create what we now know as the sort of whole global situation of Opus Dei, which, among other things, provides many of the technocrats who actually effectuate the sort of second phase of the Franco dictatorship's economic turn toward economic liberalization, basically, and who then also are very influential among the Chicago Boys and in the whole sort of universe of Latin Americans who are experimenting with deregulatory economic policies in the late 60s and into the early 70s. And Chile being the kind of most famous laboratory for that, but not the only place where there was an effort to basically modernize and adapt the authoritarianism of interwar fascism into a kind of economic policy that could be compatible with some extent of liberal electoral democracy, right? With the institutions of electoral democracy. How can we basically engineer the economy in ways that will allow us to perpetuate this system past the point when it is no longer politically possible for us to maintain overt military dictatorships? And that is what, and Chileans today are still dealing with the sequelae of that, one of the things that Franco is sort of one of his catchphrases that he's most famous for is that because Franco was dying for a long time, right? Like you use the phrase terminal decline in one of your questions, and that's exactly, he was dying for a long time, right? There was a Saturday Night Live joke about this for many, many years, right? Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead. And so he was like on life support for a really, really, really long time, and he finally dies. And, so as it becomes clear that he's entering the long run of dying, he takes care to leave things institutionally in Spain such that, as he imagines, Franquismo will survive the man himself, right? And so the phrase is that he's left everything atado y bien atado, right? I've left everything all tied up. And Chileans use that language very explicitly to talk about the ways in which the Pinochet dictatorship similarly left everything muy bien atado with the 1980 Constitution, with the way that they rewrote labor law, and with the privatization of education, with the economic model, right? El modelo de Chile. And so that is a set of fetters that Chilean activists are continuing to strain against as they try and envision a different kind of modality for the 21st century. And, that Cast having just been elected as a kind of overt, ardent Pinochetista, I think speaks to the ongoing vitality, unfortunately, of that project.
Before I turn to the left, just listening to you, and especially about Nájera, that's his last name?
Vallejo Nájera. Yeah, his grandchildren went to Harvard. One of my research assistants found out, interestingly, quite recently, which is we do not get to pick our grandparents, to be very clear, so no aspersions. But it was just interesting that this is a surname that still circulates, right? So, Vallejo Nájera.
Yes, so listening to you talking about him and at the risk of sort of validating his, philosophical bona fide, it seems to me that it's quite remarkable in his theory. It's, in a way, an inverted form of racialism if you compare it to the late 19th century German, French, or even American racialism, in the sense that in the European model, the pure race is the white race or the Aryan race, whatever you want to call it, and then the others, the inferior ones, are sort of mixed race, right? So it's kind of a dilution of the purity. Whereas with him, it seems to be reverted, in the sense that the only pure one are those who carry the red genes, whereas the white people have much more universalist possibility in the sense that, as you said, if they take on the proper religion, if they're accultured in the right way, then they become fully white. So you can become white, but you cannot escape redness, except if you are taken as a baby and put in a white family. So it's a very specific racialism. So it's not that I want to, elevate him as a true philosopher.
No, totally.
Though in the age of Curtis Yarvin, what's the threshold for being a philosopher?
This is the
but nonetheless, it's a remarkable and very singular form of racialism there.
Yeah, and it also comes out of this Crusades, Reconquista mentality where, they basically, where if Jews convert and become conversos, then they're allowed to provisionally remain part of the polity, although their authority will always be suspect, right? And they can always be undermined. And this, so Franco was a raging anti-Semite, right? And this is a part of the whole Spanish Civil War story that doesn't get talked about as much. But his bugbears were, the Judeo-Masonic Bolshevik conspiracy. That was who he had in his sight lines. And that comes out of, again, then the enemies are non-Catholics, liberals, incarnated in the Spanish context as Freemasons, right, and Bolsheviks. But that's kind of the trinity of evil, right, is to not be Catholic, to be a liberal, and to be a Marxist. And those things are kind of co-equivalent. So like the idea that racial, the sort of supremacy inheres in a religious interpretation of the race is, I think, particular to the Spanish imperial formation and 1492 and the Reconquest and all of that stuff, in a way that it's not elsewhere in Europe. But yeah, it does. The problem is that there is the theory of what someone like Vallejo Nájera put down on paper, and then there is the reality of what the regime actually did, how the regime actually operationalizes these ideas. And the reality is that they just kill whoever they want to, and they kind of forget the theories, right? So like, yes, we can redeem, we can be good Catholics by not murdering the families of the leftists and giving the children beautiful new homes, but then in practice they actually just, left the leftist parents to rot and die in jail or shot them by firing squad or whatever else. So, there was a lot of apparatus around the kind of cocktail of right-wing variants that are present in Franquismo, but the practice of it is really just the sort of exercise and consolidation of power and the elimination of dissent, challenges to rule, etc. And there are fractions and there are rivalries within the Spanish right, even at the height of the dictatorship, and Franco was able to kind of put them down, manage them, resolve them, get rid of, a troublesome individual or someone who's, angering some other segment of the coalition. But basically the coalition hangs together. And, in a way that that history does not give us a ton of examples of left coalitions being able to do. And it is in this way, among probably other ways, that Franco and Trump are, kind of confrères of a certain type, in that they both seem to have this kind of preternatural talent for managing teams of rivals from, quite different positions on issues like abortion or the church or economic policy or whatever, and is able to manage basically through the sort of force of personality and a relentless focus on who the enemy is, what is the worse evil, is able to actually build quite enduring right-wing political coalitions that seem, thus far, at least in the Trump version of it, to be able to surf over what would, in other kinds of political contexts or in different sort of ideological arrangements, would be like devastating cleavages or fissures within those coalitions.